You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking with Michele Brittany about silent films, from classics to forgotten gems to lost movies. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, Pete Charbonneau, and we've got a Fan2Fan All-Star, Michele Brittany, and we're talking about a topic that she's passionate about that I hope this will be as much informative as it will be entertaining for listeners. A little bit about Michele. She's a writer, editor, photographer, and pop culture scholar. She has interests that lie in horror, spy, and gothic genres. She has edited a few essay collections, including the Bram Stoker Award-nominated Horror in Space critical essays on the film subgenre. You can find Michele's blog, more info about her work at her website, Michele Brittany, 1 L in Michele, 2 T's in Brittany, and along with partner Nick Dyack, they co-host the HP Lovecast podcast that's dedicated to the works of Lovecraft. Michele and Nick have been very generous with their time, kind enough to come on the podcast to talk about quite a lot of different topics, from Sword and Sandal movies to Highlander to Phantasm. So Michele, thanks for coming back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It's been a little bit of time, so it's very nice to be back among such wonderful friends. So, and I've gotten to meet you both now. So
now you can pick us out of a lineup, Michele. So even better.
Before we get started, I just want to say that because we are talking about the topic of silent films, that this will be the last that I'm speaking, and that all of my dialogue, I've hired an orchestra, and so it's going to be an interpretive thing. So the orchestra will play my questions and anecdotes, and hopefully everyone listening can interpret. Thank you, and thank you all for being here.
So we're talking about silent films, a topic that I know, Pete, you're a fan of Chaplin. He's obviously known for Modern Times, The Kid, the tramp character that he made so iconic. And you've talked about him a little bit in the past. So have you seen a lot of the Chaplin shorts? Like, did you grow up watching them? How were you exposed to Chaplin?
I can't say that I've seen a ton. I think, like you, this is silent films, although I have a tremendous appreciation for them, certainly more so as I've gotten older. It's definitely a blind spot for me. And so I'm excited to talk to Michele and to get, some of her insight on some of this, because, we did some of our own research ahead of this episode, seeing very different types of silent films than I was used to seeing. But yeah, I mean, I've read Chaplin's biography. City Lights is one of my all-time favorite films. I had the privilege and the pleasure to see that in a theater in St. Louis, with, fellow guest John Zemsky with a full orchestra that was playing. I believe Chaplin wrote the music for that as well, and the orchestra was playing his score. What a wonderful experience that was. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, another silent favorite of mine. So I have a couple of touch points when it comes to silent films, but by no means do I know a bunch. And just kind of a fan of the genre, the Chaplins, the Harold Lloyds, Buster Keaton, like that type of comedy is a lot of stuff that I've resonated towards. But I think we're going to be, expanding our scope well beyond just those silent comedies today.
And I'm glad you mentioned silent touch points, Pete, because when I think of the silent film era for myself, outside of Chaplin, Buster Keaton, I think a lot of the Mount Rushmore examples that are out there, like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the visuals that, were so influential for a lot of filmmakers. I mean, you can't look at C-3PO and not see a lot of Metropolis DNA in the design. Nosferatu, in the world of horror, not only, is it iconic visually, but inspiring to so many iterations of the vampire. A Trip to the Moon, that's always one that I thought was always interesting, especially when I found out that they hand painted a lot of the cells for that. So whenever I saw that, while I think it was way over my head, I could not appreciate it when I was younger, but there was something about it that felt Ray Harryhausen-like. So I think now when I see it, I can see that there's maybe some, connective tissue between Trip to the Moon and something that Ray Harryhausen worked on. So taking the role of the listener and being empathetic to them, that may be the extent of what they may know about silent films, but I think this is where we're lucky, Pete, to talk to people like Michele, because that's also probably the extent of my knowledge on silent films. And that's where Michele comes in and gets to talk about something that she knows much more about. So, Michele, why are you into silent films? And I know we'll get into City Symphony and specifically some of the films that you had given us in our homework assignment. And yes, Michele gave us a homework assignment with a few things to watch. But how did you get into this?
I think the first silent film that I saw was back in the mid to late 80s when I watched Metropolis with the Giorgio soundtrack to it. That was such an unusual experience to me to watch something that was silent, to not have, actors' dialogue, but to have music to go with it and more modern music, which made it very anachronistic. That was probably my very first time watching a silent film. From there, then when I was attending university, pursuing my bachelor's degree in communications, I, of course, took an interest in film because I had a long interest in film, but hadn't gotten into the silent cinema at all until I was in a class where we started watching some of the early ones. And so, we did watch Metropolis, but we also got into watching F.W. Murnau's, obviously Nosferatu, but also Sunrise, which was, I think, from 1927, a silent film. And I think seeing that particular film is what kind of got me going into the arena of the City Symphony films that we're really here to talk about today. But kind of a quick summary about Sunrise is that there is a man, he's in the country, in a little village, and there is a city woman who comes there. She lures him away into the city where there are bright lights, there's nighttime activity, there's this allure of a whole different life. Murnau does a beautiful job with his technical skills, doing track shots and that were very new at the time. And so that was probably one of the first things that kind of drew me into what are these City Symphony films and what makes them different from the fictional portrayal of cities, where they tended to be, kind of the third tier character in our fictional movies in the early cinema.
When did these City Symphony films, when were they produced or released?
They were in the 1920s. The very first one is Manhatta, which I know, Bernie, you mentioned that you've seen. Pete, did you happen to watch that one?
I did, yeah. Very excited to talk about that. And also your other homework assignment of apropos Denise. Yeah, both. I was fascinated watching both of them. So yes.
Oh, okay. Great. So Manhatta was made in 1921, and that's kind of considered the earliest City Symphony film, where it really is focused in on the city. In this particular case, it's New York City. People become kind of a unified mass, and really the camera turns on the buildings, the architecture, the modern spectacle, the automobiles, the trolleys, the boats, the cruise ships, communications, all those type of things that were new and exciting and very different from the portrayal that you were seeing in fictional stories. So Manhatta really is that first one. And believe it or not, City Symphonies are still produced today in an experimental format. Probably the most recognized ones would be like Andy Warhol's Empire from the 1960s. His focus is on New York City. And Jacques Tati's Playtime, where he actually created an entire city. It broke him financially, but the movie is just absolutely fantastic. But we have more recent ones too. I haven't seen them, so I'm not qualified to speak to the most recent ones that are out there. But they are kind of by nature very experimental.
So I'm curious to know if you know this, Michele, because I got a sense certainly from Manhatta, even apropos Deniso, that one gets a little more experimental. And then I also watched Berlin Symphony of a Great City, which I think there's a tremendous juxtaposition between at least how that one starts with the sparseness of Berlin as the day starts, to Manhatta, which kind of kicks off with this, the Staten Island ferry unloading just like a sea of humanity into the city. But the thinking of the time period, like 1921, even the U.S. still very much like a rural agrarian society at that point. Were these kind of viewed as almost like a window into like a new world for like a majority of the population of the country at the time?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The City Symphony films really did focus in on technology that was occurring at that time. Definitely focused on what's going on in an urban environment. I actually looked before I got on because I was really curious about, this idea of comparison between a rural and a more urban environment. The fact that these films really focus in on the modern and what was transpiring in the cities. So I was really kind of surprised that in the 1920s, it was probably about a 50-50 split of an urban versus a rural population distribution. So I actually was under the impression that it was greater towards urban, or not urban, but a rural population. So I was actually quite surprised that after World War I that there was a bit of a shift population-wise. And the 1920s saw the first kind of even split between rural and urban populations. So there was definitely more people that were interacting with the urban. Obviously we had the Industrial Revolution in the late 1860s, 1870s, when, it was definitely not that kind of spread population-wise. So those that were landing in the city, here all of a sudden you've got like the rise of the department store, which really didn't exist. It was a mercantile on the corner, in your little town. So, now suddenly you see these department store windows with appliances that you've never seen, when you're used to washing your clothes on a little single board with metal, scrubbing back and forth. Now you have washing machines, and you've got sewing machines and bicycles, and, just all matter of modern items that you're learning to use. And it's also giving rise to a consumerism that we didn't have before. You're moving away from working the land to working in an urban environment where you're going to work. During World War I, we had a lot of men off at war, so women were entering the workforce at that time. So you definitely see what's interesting, like Manhatta, for instance, Pete, when you mentioned that you see this throng of individuals coming off the ferry, most of them were men. But when you start looking at like Berlin, I'm sure you probably noticed that there were a lot more women going off to work, and that film was, let me think a minute, that was 1927. So you're talking, a 6-year difference, a lot of changes. You even have a light bulb. Out in the country, you didn't have electricity like you did in the city. So there really was a spectacle going on. And these films are part of kind of the document for that time period, but it also is a spectacle of modernity and all the positive and negative chaos that comes with that.
Yeah, I think you can certainly tell in a lot of these films there's that friction there of of the way forward and progress, and some of them delve quite explicitly on the haves and the have-nots and that divide, which even back then you can kind of really see that stark difference. What I liked about Manhatta was you've got, I would say it was Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand. Paul Strand, who did the photography, Charles Sheeler, who was a painter, I believe, that I think directed it, getting to like really interesting spots around the city and shooting a lot of like from the top of buildings down, and you're kind of just, not fly on the wall, but, just take almost like a bird's eye view of people kind of going about their daily lives there, which again, I have to imagine it was probably fairly revolutionary to kind of get up into the spots that they were getting, framing some of their shots. I mean, I remember I believe it was the Brooklyn Bridge towards the end. There's just like this gorgeously framed shot of the bridge, and you can kind of, it's like backlit from the sky. And, you're seeing a lot of that artistic, side coming in, while it may be more travelogue-esque, there's an art to it, it seems.
Definitely. And that's a very good point that you made with regards to that particular partnership, because before then, films were only about 20 years old at that particular time. When films came about in the 1890s, really, with some of the early Lumiere brothers and their films that they were doing, it was really focused in on daily life. And so it's not a big leap to move to City Symphonies that would then focus back on what was transpiring around these filmmakers, and the fact that, with film, you were moving from a static moment in time, what you would capture on canvas, to what you were capturing with the film. And the fact that it wasn't just one moment. Now you have several frames that make up a segment. And so that was really exciting. Also, again, the point that you make, you're getting these really high angles. Nobody was flying at that time. I mean, we had the Wright brothers, but how many people were getting on planes? It wasn't really a commercial, way of going around and being able to see aerial shots unless you got into a balloon. I know I was actually struck revisiting Propos de Nice, which was actually, I think, from 1930, and just how many aerial shots there were. And you do get that with Berlin. And I think, trying to think, Man with a Movie Camera, I think they focus more on high angle shots rather than aerial shots, although they did show some planes. But that was all views that little us, down on the ground would have seen, and had the opportunity to be able to be up on the scaffolding of skyscrapers looking at these modern marvels. I mean, if you think back to the pictures of New York City as they were building these skyscrapers, and I think the ones that I'm talking about, where the men are sitting on scaffolding and they're high above the city,
eating their lunch, just something very baffling. That
all the safety precautions.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. But those are still awe-inspiring today. And I really think that these films are also that way. If you approach these films as thinking of, you've never been in a plane, you've never been in a high rise, and now you're getting to see all these different vantage points. Now, I don't think you guys got to watch Man with a Movie Camera, but there are a lot of low angles. There's images inside a coal mine that, we wouldn't normally get to see. There's even a burst scene, and these are all things that you wouldn't normally see. Mm-hmm. So these films are really an incredible document to that particular time, particularly the fact that this is the 1920s. These are the interwar years when we've come out of what we figure is the only world war that we'll ever have. Things are great. We're coming out of the darkest period of early 20th century. Everything cuts loose. Think of the 1960s, but in the 1920s, free love and all that. But on top of that, you then have all these modern conveniences that you didn't have before. This new freedom, earn money to have these activities. You didn't have to end your day at 5 or 6 o'clock when the sun went down. You could go into the evening. You could go dancing at these beautiful ballrooms. You could go, to the cinema in these beautiful palaces that were like fairy tales. So these were all things that were brand new, and how to really kind of normalize that were through these City Symphony films, because otherwise you had fictional portrayals that were fantasy, but here's the real thing. And that's what's incredible about these films. And I hope I excite you guys to go back and take a look at Man with a Movie Camera, which is completely experimental and so different. I mean, you get a taste with Apropos de Nice, with kind of split images and the following the eye as the camera moves, and the curve of the building and things like that. Vertov with Man with a Movie Camera just amps it up 100, and just his total freedom and experimenting with the visual, how that experience brings on all these different emotions. Obviously, there's a political or social aspect to Vertov and the embracing of the modern, and the fact that we are on the cusp of a whole new world with everything that's going on in the 20s. So it really is a fascinating time, these documents. And you don't have the same, I think, kind of experimental that happens at this time, because not only are you seeing all these different visuals, but you're also seeing a lot of different camera techniques that you don't see as much today. Once in a while, you get something that's really unique and cool. But for the most part, we've seen pretty much what you can do with a camera. And of course, in the 1920s, you've moved away from cameras that were very bulky. You had to put them on a tripod. You couldn't move them. You had to have a static shot. Now with these cameras, they're small enough where you can move around. You can follow the action. You can pan with the action. You can take a low angle. You can take a high angle. You can get up into skyscrapers or on top of a building and look down at the world and think that the possibilities are endless. And I think that that's kind of what these City Symphony films brings to the audience at that time. I mean, I wish I could go back, wipe the slate clean, and see these as a 1920s audience would have seen it. And I mean, you probably would have been, in your seat, just awestruck. It would have been like the Lumiere brothers when they, shot the train coming towards the camera. Mm-hmm. And you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get hit by this train.
Sure.
Because it was so new.
I'm glad you brought up the audiences, because I was trying to think context-wise. Like you mentioned World War I, and that ends in 1918, and Manhattan, which is really just Manhattan without the N at the end, made me start thinking about that audience and how, in some ways, like that felt to me what would be the modern equivalence of a Ken Burns documentary. I say that in an audience, a world, and not to be 100% United States centric, but a globe that has now experienced a world war. So maybe global politics has collapsed a little bit because they've been hearing about things that are happening over there, but now over there has now been defined by newsreels, by newspapers that are starting to kind of explain where things are. And they're not just on a map. Like we have people, we have brothers, fathers that are there, and then they're coming back. Maybe that curiosity continues, because then not only have you seen shots, cameras of our soldiers in Europe, but now I want to see what the East Coast looks like, what the West Coast looks like, what Manhattan looks like. And that specifically kind of gave me that sense of like, you could almost hear, was it Peter Coyote or Campbell Scott narrating them for like that audience to kind of let them know, like you were saying, there's technology that's changing. Social, political stuff is going on. We're just a few years off from the Great Depression in like 29, I think. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And you have audiences that are like you were saying, they're being introduced to this technology that's becoming available. But maybe the bigger part of that, they're being introduced to a bigger perspective. And I was thinking back again to having very few touch points about this with like Chaplin, where it seems to me, especially with silent films, comedy, and maybe it's because he did it so masterfully that that seems to lend itself well to silent films because of the physical comedy, the slapstick, but the fact that you mentioned, Michelle, also talking about themes and understanding social political issues like classism and poverty, what's going on with the rise of Nazism in Europe as well. And then be like, oh no, Chaplin was able to do the comedy and social critique. Because then when you think of The Great Dictator, it's like, okay, here's him making a commentary on that. Feels like that's all what's happening at the same time. So in some ways, it's as much entertaining. Something like Manhattan or apropos of Nice is like, also, here's a snapshot of these cities that you may have only ever heard of, maybe in a map, or maybe have mentioned in some sort of war update. Now we're just going to give you a day-to-day shot of what these people look like, because they're people like you that commute to work, that do things that people do. And I thought that was an interesting perspective in looking at those, because you have so much stuff going on in the world at the time.
Yeah, I would say that Manhatta really is kind of still I'm going to say, kind of a product of the American idealism and still the manifest destiny that was, very prevalent at that time. Manhatta is the only city symphony from the 1920s. Everything else is actually over in Europe. And so obviously they're going to have a different perspective, and they're going to have a different, commentary about their life because the war occurred over there. I think probably the closest to kind of a comedy or satire would be Apropos de Nice, which was directed by Jean Vigo. He had a very short film career. He died young, and this was actually his first film. For a little bit of context, his cinematographer was Boris Kaufman, who was the brother of Derja Vertov. That was kind of his name that he took, but he was born Dennis Kaufman. His other brother, Michele, is the cinematographer for A Man with a Movie Camera. So it's kind of interesting how, there's different touch points. I would say that the films over in Europe definitely had more social commentary to express in their films. They also occurred at a later time in the 1920s. So I would say that they also had more to discuss because, like you said earlier, Bernie, the Great Depression happened in October of 1929. But earlier in the mid 1920s, Germany was really having a difficult time. This is part of what led to World War II, is the fact that a lot of the war debt was placed squarely on them. And so their economy was just really awful. Their studio was, subsidized through monies from other places. So there was a lot to say about Germany at that time. I would say that Apropos de Nice is also kind of a little bit different from Berlin and Man with a Movie Camera, because it does make kind of, light commentary between people and tourists, specifically with regards to going to Nice and, sunbathing on the sidewalk, looking, at the ocean. And it's much more leisure oriented than Berlin and Man with a Movie Camera, which definitely took a more social commentary approach. They were also trying to do other things. They were aware of each other, by the way. And Vertov took kind of offense that Man with a Movie Camera was compared with Berlin, because he felt that he was doing something quite different with his film than Berlin. But you can definitely see there are different common threads, theme-wise, as well as visuals, and you can even see it in Apropos de Nice. There's some different visuals that occur in that take from the others. And I don't know if you also got to watch Rain, which is directed by Jarvis Ivens, but that is like an afternoon rainstorm in Amsterdam. And that takes kind of a city approach, but it's more framed around afternoon storm that comes into the city, and it's very poetic.
And that's the end of part one of our conversation with Michele Brittany about the City Symphony films. I hope you found this to be an entertaining and educational conversation. I know that Pete and I certainly learned a lot. Every time we talk to Michele or any of our guests, we always seem to learn a lot about filmmaking, about the things that our fans, our guests are passionate about, which is always fun. Because when you talk to someone who's passionate about something, you can't help but get a little excited, a little passionate about it because their energy rubs off on you. So tune into next time where we continue talking with Michele about silent films, about city symphonies, and much, much more.